The chandeliers of the Grand Astoria ballroom dripped crystal light, their glow refracting through 1,000 champagne flutes, held by 1,000 powerful hands. The air was thick with the scent of money, a cloying mix of expensive perfume, aged scotch, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. To Ilara Vance, it was the smell of a gilded cage. She stood near the edge of the dais, a slim figure in a midnight blue gown, her posture a study in serene composure. Inside, her heart hammered a frantic, syncopated rhythm against her ribs. Tonight was meant to be her coronation, the Vanguard Award, a prestigious honor recognizing the brightest young mind in finance, was hers. It was the culmination of a decade spent clawing her way out of the long, dark shadow of her family's name. A polite ripple of applause swelled as Richard Keller approached the lectern. He was a titan, a man carved from granite and tailored silk, his silver hair catching the light like a crown. He was the CEO of Keller Global, the firm that had absorbed the smoldering ruins of her father's company. And he was the man who had personally chosen her for this award. It was a public anointing, a declaration that the Vance name, once synonymous with disgrace, was finally redeemed through her. Good evening. Richard's voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded silence. It was the voice of a man who never had to ask for attention. Tonight, we celebrate the future. We celebrate innovation, tenacity, and the kind of sharp, hungry intelligence that will define the next generation of leadership. He smiled, a broad, paternal expression that didn't quite reach the cold calculation in his eyes. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the sea of expectant faces before it settled on Ilara. And no one embodies that future more than Ilara Vance. A wave of warmth, a dangerous mix of relief and pride, washed over Ilara. This was it, the moment of absolution. Richard continued, his smile tightening fractionally. When we look at Ilara, we see a ferocity, an almost desperate drive to succeed. It's a remarkable quality, a fire forged in the crucible of adversity. He let the word adversity hang in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. The low murmur of the room quieted. A few people shifted in their seats. They knew the story. Everyone in this room knew the story of Arthur Vance. Some of you may remember her father. Arthur, Richard said, his tone shifting to one of mock sympathy. A brilliant man. In his own way, a visionary. He dreamed of building an empire that would touch the sky. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Of course, we all know what happens when you fly too close to the sun. Wings melt. Empires fall. The air in the ballroom turned to ice. It was no longer a speech. It was a vivisection, performed with surgical precision under the glare of 1,000 lights. Ilara felt the collective stare of the room as a physical weight. She kept her expression placid, her hands resting calmly on the back of a velvet chair, but her knuckles were white. Arthur had ambition. Richard went on, a predatory glint in his eye, a truly boundless ambition. It's a trait he clearly passed down to his daughter. He turned to Ilara, his voice dripping with condescending praise. Let us all hope she also acquired a better sense of risk management, a more grounded understanding of the rules. It was a masterclass in sophisticated cruelty. Each word was a poisoned dart, publicly deniable, but privately devastating. He wasn't just congratulating her. He was branding her with her father's failure, reminding everyone that she was the daughter of a pariah, a man who had died in disgrace after a catastrophic financial collapse that had wiped out thousands of investors. He was telling them that her success was not her own, but merely a desperate reaction to her father's sin, and that the same tainted blood ran through her veins. Ilara did not flinch. She did not look away. She held Richard's gaze, her expression unreadable. Inside, a cold, familiar fury coiled in her stomach. This was not the first time a man like Richard had tried to diminish her, to define her by a past that was not hers. But it would be the last. Her composure was not a mask for pain. It was a shield, forged and tempered in the fires he had just so eloquently described. It was the calm of a predator that has been watching its prey for a very long time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the scattered, uncertain applause began, Richard raised a hand for silence, a final flourish to his performance. So, let's give a warm welcome to the recipient of this year's Vanguard Award, a young woman who has overcome so much, Ilara Vance. Ilara walked toward the lectern, her steps measured and deliberate. The midnight blue silk of her gown whispered against the floor. She passed Richard, the scent of his expensive cologne, a phantom touch against her skin. She reached the microphone and looked out at the silent, watching faces. She could feel their pity, their morbid curiosity. "Thank you, Richard," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the storm raging within her. For that memorable introduction, she allowed a small, cool smile to touch her lips. "My father taught me many things, but the most important lesson was that the greatest risk is not in flying too high, but in underestimating your opponent." She paused, letting her eyes find Richard's in the front row. "It's a lesson I've taken to heart." The room remained silent, caught in the unnerving stillness of her response. In that moment, the narrative shifted. She was no longer the victim of a public shaming. She was a contender, and the silent, gilded ballroom had just become an arena. The shadow of her father's legacy was a physical presence in Ilara's life. It lived in the stark, minimalist lines of her downtown apartment, a space scrubbed clean of personal history. It echoed in the hushed, respectful tones of her colleagues at Sterling Cross, the investment firm where she had built her career on a foundation of unimpeachable data and ruthless efficiency. Arthur Vance had been a man of grand gestures and reckless gambles. Ilara was a woman of quiet precision and calculated moves. His portrait, a handsome man with haunted eyes, sat not on her mantel, but on a dusty shelf in a storage unit, a ghost she refused to entertain. Her life was a carefully constructed fortress against the chaos he had left behind. Her days were a blur of algorithms and market projections. Her nights spent in the sterile glow of a monitor, searching for patterns in the endless flow of capital. Her only confidant was Chloe Chang, a fiercely loyal investigative journalist who had known Ilara since college, long before the name Vance became a curse. "He didn't just insult you, Ilara. He branded you," Chloe said, her voice sharp with anger. They sat in a small, out-of-the-way coffee shop 2 days after the gala, the scent of roasting beans a welcome antidote to the suffocating opulence of the Astoria. In front of everyone, it was a power play. "He was putting you back in your box." "He was reminding me that he owns my father's story," Ilara corrected, stirring her black coffee with a slow, methodical motion. "And, by extension, he believes he owns mine." "So what are you going to do?" Chloe leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Write a scathing op-ed. I can get it placed anywhere." "No," Ilara said calmly. "A public response is what he wants. It would be emotional, reactive. It would prove his point that I'm just like my father." She took a sip of her coffee. "I'm going to do nothing." Chloe stared at her, baffled. "Nothing, Ilara. This isn't like you. The Ilara I know would be building a multi-phase strategic retaliation plan, complete with flowcharts." "I am," Ilara replied, a flicker of something cold and hard in her gaze. "But first, I need to understand why. It wasn't just a casual power play. It was too personal, too pointed. He was warning me. The question is, about what? The other pillar in Alara's professional life was Marcus Thorne, a senior executive at a rival firm. Marcus had been a friend of her father's in the early days, before the spectacular rise and fall. After Arthur's death, Marcus had become a reluctant mentor to Alara, guiding her through the treacherous currents of an industry that wanted to forget her name. He was a man of old-world charm and quiet authority. His office, a sanctuary of dark wood and leather-bound books high above the city. Richard is a predator. Alara. He smells ambition on you, the same way he smelled it on your father. Marcus advised when she met him later that week. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice, clinking softly. He's insecure. Your success reflects well on the Vanguard Award, but it also creates a new Vance legacy, one he can't control. He's reminding you who holds the leash. He mentioned the rules, Alara said, her mind replaying the speech. He said he hoped I had a better understanding of them. He was referring to Arthur's downfall, Marcus said, his expression clouded with a distant sorrow. Your father bent the rules until they broke. He leveraged everything on a single, high-risk venture, the Phoenix Project. When the market turned, he was overextended. He couldn't cover the losses. Keller Global swept in and picked the carcass clean. It was brutal, but it was legal. I've read the public reports, Alara said. It was a straightforward bankruptcy, a story of hubris. And that's the story Richard wants everyone to remember. Marcus affirmed, don't give him a reason to write a new chapter. Keep your head down. Do your work. Your success will be your revenge. But Alara couldn't shake the feeling that the public story was a carefully crafted fiction. That night, driven by an instinct she couldn't name, she drove to the storage unit. The air inside was stale and cold. In the back, behind a stack of furniture draped in white sheets, was a heavy, steel safe. It was the only thing she had kept from her father's office. She had never known the combination. She had never wanted to. For 10 years, it had remained a silent monument to his failure. Tonight, it felt like a locked box of secrets. She ran her fingers over the cold metal dial. Her father had been a man of patterns and codes, obsessed with historical dates. She tried his birthday. Nothing. Her mother's birthday. Nothing. The date his company was founded. The lock remained stubbornly shut. Frustrated, she was about to give up when a memory surfaced. A childhood memory of her father teaching her chess, his finger tapping the board. Always protect the king. Alara. But remember, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. Her birthday, 08-1694. She entered the numbers slowly. The lock clicked open. Inside, nestled among old stock certificates and property deeds, was a single leather-bound journal. It was not a diary, but a ledger. The pages were filled with her father's elegant, sloping script, detailing transactions and meetings. Most of it was mundane, but as she flipped through the final entries, a series of annotations in a different ink caught her eye. They were cryptic, almost poetic. October 12th, RK promises the sun, but I fear the burn. The phoenix must rise, he says, but I only see ashes. October 29th. The architecture is complete. A beautiful, hollow structure. One wrong move, and the whole thing comes down on me. RK assures me the fail-safes are in his hands. Whose hands? I wonder. November 5th. He calls me his partner, but a partner shares the risk. I feel I am carrying it all. The key is in the Iliad, page 78. Alara's breath caught. R.K. Richard Keller. Her father had kept a small, treasured collection of classic literature. She knew exactly where it was. Back in her apartment. She pulled the worn, leather-bound copy of the Iliad from a box in her closet. On page 78, a single line was underlined, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." Tucked into the spine of the book was a tiny skeleton key. It took her another hour to find the lock it belonged to, a false bottom in the old safe. Inside was a small, encrypted hard drive and a single, folded sheet of paper. On it was a complex alphanumeric string, a password. Her hands trembled as she connected the drive to her laptop. This was it. The reason for Richard's warning. He hadn't been warning her away from her father's mistakes. He had been warning her away from the truth. The screen lit up, asking for the password. She typed in the code from the paper. Access granted. The drive contained a mirror of her father's entire digital life from his final year. Emails, encrypted communications, financial models. But one file stood out, labeled simply Phoenix Partners, PDF. She opened it. It was a partnership agreement, a founding document for a secret, off-the-books venture, a venture designed to exploit a legal loophole with massive, calculated risk. It was dated 2 years before her father's company collapsed, and at the bottom, there were 2 signatures, side by side, in bold, confident strokes. Arthur Vance and Richard Keller. The document on her screen was not a smoking gun. It was a ghost, a specter of a past she had never known, rewriting a history she had spent her life trying to escape. Her father wasn't Richard Keller's victim. He was his partner. The public narrative, the cautionary tale of a lone cowboy capitalist who flew too close to the sun, was a lie. This was a story of 2 men, not one, and one of them was still standing. The inciting incident had passed. Alara was no longer just defending her name. She was hunting for the truth of her father's. Her first move was to start digging into the Phoenix Project, not as a public failure, but as the secret joint venture the document described. She needed access to historical trading data, SEC filings from the period, and internal communications from both her father's defunct company, Vance Capital and Keller Global. Her position at Sterling Cross gave her the tools, but using them for a personal investigation was a fireable offense, a risk she had to take. She worked methodically, building a fortress of data around herself in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. She created a ghost server, routing her searches through a complex web of proxies, leaving no digital footprints that could be traced back to her terminal. The work was slow, a painstaking archaeological dig through mountains of digital sediment. She started seeing the pattern within a week. A series of shell corporations, registered in obscure offshore jurisdictions, all linked by a common thread of transactions moving in and out of both Vance Capital and Keller Global. It was the beautiful, hollow structure her father had described in his journal, a sophisticated machine designed to obscure the flow of money. Her investigation did not go unnoticed. 2 weeks after the gala, she was called into her division head's office. The air was thick with a corporate tension that signaled an execution. "Alara, your performance numbers are exemplary," her boss, a man named Henderson, began, avoiding her eyes. "But we've had to make some tough decisions. A strategic realignment. Your position is being eliminated." It was a lie, and they both knew it. There was no realignment. It was an expulsion. "I see," Alara said, her voice betraying no emotion. "And this has nothing to do with the fact that I've been running deep archive queries on Keller Global's M&A activity from a decade ago." Henderson's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Alara stood up, her movements calm and deliberate. Tell Richard his warning was received, but so was my father's. She walked out of the office, leaving Henderson speechless. The box of her personal effects was already waiting at her desk. She had been surgically removed. Richard Keller's influence was a long and powerful arm, capable of reaching into the heart of a rival firm to crush a perceived threat before it could even form. He hadn't just fired her, he had blacklisted her. He had severed her access to the tools she needed, cutting off her resources and isolating her from the industry she had mastered. The stakes had just been raised from reputation to survival. The weeks that followed were a descent into a new reality. Alara, the rising star, became a pariah. Calls went unreturned. Job interviews were mysteriously canceled at the last minute. The severance package from Sterling Cross was generous, but it was finite. Richard was trying to bleed her out, to force her into submission through financial attrition. She operated from the shadows now. Her apartment transformed into a command center. Chloe became her lifeline to the outside world, using her press credentials to access public records and archives that were now closed to Alara. He's building a wall around the past. Alara, Chloe said, dropping a stack of dusty municipal records onto Alara's dining table. Every shell corporation I look into, the paper trail goes cold. Records are missing. Files have been sealed. It's like someone went back in time and erased the breadcrumbs. Someone did, Alara said, her eyes scanning a complex flowchart she had drawn on a large whiteboard. It was a web of names, dates, and transactions, all connected to the Phoenix Project. He's not just covering his tracks. He's afraid. My father must have left something behind, something that could still burn him. Her mentor, Marcus Thorne, remained her strategic advisor. He was appalled by Richard's move to have her fired, his outrage seeming genuine and deeply felt. This is how he operates. Marcus fumed, pacing his opulent office. He doesn't compete. He annihilates. He did the same to Arthur. He used your father's brilliance to build the Phoenix Project, and, when it became unstable, he positioned himself to be the sole survivor. But what was the project Alara pressed? The files on the drive are all technical, financial models and legal frameworks. I need the narrative. Marcus sighed, sinking into a leather armchair. It was a ghost entity. It would acquire distressed assets, bundle them using an incredibly complex derivative structure that Arthur designed, and sell them at an inflated value. It was brilliant, but it was built on a house of cards. When the subprime market started to show cracks, Richard knew the whole thing would implode. He had a choice: go down with the ship, or push his partner overboard and claim the lifeboat for himself. His guidance was invaluable, pointing Alara toward specific regulatory loopholes and financial instruments she hadn't considered. He helped her connect the dots, his encyclopedic knowledge of the industry's underbelly filling in the gaps in her research. Yet, she noticed something odd. Marcus always steered her focus toward Richard's financial malfeasance, the cold, hard numbers of the fraud. Whenever she asked about the personal relationship between her father and Richard, he became vague, dismissive. They weren't friends. Alara. It was a business arrangement, a deeply toxic one. But Alara wasn't so sure. One evening, while sifting through a box of her father's old photo albums Chloe had retrieved from storage, she found a picture she had never seen before. It was from a fishing trip, dated 3 years before the collapse. 2 men stood on the deck of a boat, holding up a large marlin, grinning broadly at the camera. One was her father. The other was Richard Keller. They didn't look like business associates. They looked like best friends. Another clue emerged from her father's journal, a cryptic entry beside a series of calculations. M.T. brokered the peace. He says we are a triumvirate now, 3 legs of a stool. But I know what happens when one leg is shorter than the others. The whole thing topples. M.T. Marcus Thorne. She was not just uncovering a financial crime. She was excavating a betrayal between three men who were once bound by something more than just business. As she pieced together the fragments, Richard's surveillance on her intensified. A black sedan was often parked across the street from her apartment. Her laptop's camera light would flicker on at odd times. Her phone calls had a faint, telltale echo. He wasn't just watching her. He was trying to intimidate her, to make her feel the weight of his power. But fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. With each new piece of the puzzle, her grief for the father she thought she knew was being replaced by a cold, clarifying rage. The humiliation at the gala felt like a distant memory, a prelude to a much larger war. This was no longer about justice for a wronged man. It was about vengeance for a betrayed partner, a ruined family, and a stolen history. The midpoint of her investigation arrived not with a single, dramatic revelation, but with the slow, dawning horror of connecting two seemingly unrelated pieces of data. One was a set of wire transfers from the Phoenix Project's main account to an unlisted holding company in the Cayman Islands. The other was a property deed Chloe had unearthed from a county archive for a luxury penthouse apartment purchased by the same holding company. The authorized signatory on the deed was Richard Keller. The transfers were dated the week before her father's company declared bankruptcy. It was the smoking gun. Richard hadn't just survived the collapse. He had looted the project on his way out, draining its assets into his personal accounts, while publicly blaming the entire failure on his partner. He hadn't just pushed her father overboard. He had stolen his life jacket and wallet before he did it. Alara stared at the documents, her reflection a pale shadow on the dark screen. The story was finally clear. This was not a case of a corporate predator. This was a deep and personal betrayal, a conspiracy born of greed and fear. Her quest for justice had been an intellectual exercise. This new understanding transformed it into a blood debt. Richard Keller hadn't just ruined her father's company. He had destroyed the man himself, and he had done it for money. Her grief, once a dull ache, sharpened into a weapon. The game had changed. The objective was no longer to clear her father's name. It was to obliterate Richard Keller's. The moment Alara found the wire transfers, she knew she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer a researcher. She was a threat. Richard must have known it too, because his retaliation was swift and devastating. It came not in the form of black sedans or digital surveillance, but in the sterile, formal language of the law. A courier delivered the summons to her apartment, her family's estate. The modest assets her mother had managed to protect from the bankruptcy was being sued. The plaintiff was a consortium of investors from the Phoenix Project, represented by a notoriously aggressive law firm. The suit claimed that Arthur Vance had fraudulently concealed personal assets during the bankruptcy proceedings a decade ago, and they were coming to collect. The evidence they cited was a series of obscure financial instruments Alara had never heard of. Supposedly held in her mother's name, it was a fabrication, but a brilliant one, woven with enough legal complexity to tie up the estate in court for years, draining its value with legal fees until there was nothing left. It was a strategic masterstroke. Richard wasn't attacking her directly. He was attacking her father's memory and her mother's security, forcing Alara to defend a battle on a new front. Her time and resources would be consumed by the lawsuit, distracting her from her investigation. "He's using the law as a weapon," Marcus said, his voice grim. When she showed him the documents, "This is his classic move. Drown your opponent in paper until they can no longer afford to swim." "They're claiming my father hid assets through my mother's accounts," Alara said, her voice tight with fury. "It's a lie. My mother knew nothing about his business. Of course it's a lie, Marcus agreed. But in a courtroom, the truth is just a story, and the person with the most expensive lawyers usually tells the winning one. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Alara, maybe it's time to stop. He's made his point. He will ruin you and your family to protect himself. Is this worth it? He started this, Alara said, her resolve hardening into steel. I'm going to finish it. But Richard's attack had a second, more insidious prong. A week later, as she was meeting with a pro bono lawyer Chloe had found to handle the estate lawsuit, Alara received a notification from her bank. Her accounts had been frozen. A federal agency was investigating her for suspicion of wire fraud. The charge was ludicrously minor. They claimed she had used her corporate card at Sterling Cross for a personal expense, a dinner with Chloe, and miscategorized it on her expense report. It was a $50 discrepancy, the kind of clerical error that would normally be resolved with a simple email. But someone had flagged it, escalated it, and transformed it into a federal case. Richard had weaponized the bureaucracy itself, framing her for a financial crime to discredit her as a witness to his own. Her reputation as a meticulous financial analyst was her greatest asset. He was systematically destroying it. She was now fighting a war on two fronts, with no income, frozen assets, and the threat of a federal charge hanging over her head. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight designed to break her. Chloe was terrified for her. This is insane. Alara, she pleaded, pacing Alara's apartment. He's trying to destroy you. You need to get out. Disappear for a while. Let this cool down. If I run, he wins, Alara replied calmly, her eyes fixed on the whiteboard, which was now almost completely covered in a chaotic web of connections. He thinks he has me trapped, but he's made a mistake. He's cornered me, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous. Her strategy had to change. A direct assault was impossible. She needed to find a lever, a single point of vulnerability in Richard's empire that she could exploit to bring the entire structure down. Marcus, ever the mentor, provided the key. The annual shareholder meeting for Keller Global is in 3 weeks. He told her during a clandestine meeting in a quiet corner of a public library. It's his coronation. He's unveiling a massive 10-year strategic plan. The press, the board, the major investors, they'll all be there. It's live-streamed globally. It is the one day of the year when Richard Keller is at his most visible, and therefore, his most vulnerable. I can't get in, Alara said. I'm not a shareholder. No, but your father was, Marcus said, a strange intensity in his eyes. After the bankruptcy, the estate was left with a handful of worthless preferred shares in Keller Global. Part of the acquisition deal. They have no real value, but they do grant the holder the right to attend and speak at the shareholder meeting. Your mother would have them, filed away with the rest of Arthur's papers. It was a long shot, but it was the only one she had. That night, she and her mother tore through boxes of old documents in the attic, and there they were 5 preferred shares of Keller Global stock. A pittance. A final insult from the man who had destroyed their family. But, as Marcus had said, they were also a ticket, a key to the arena. The final 3 weeks were a frantic race against time, while her lawyer fought delaying actions in court. Alara and Chloe worked around the clock, consolidating all the evidence into a single, devastating presentation. The wire transfers, the partnership agreement, the encrypted emails from her father's hard drive, the public records of the shell corporations. She wove them together into an undeniable narrative of fraud, theft, and betrayal. She knew Richard would have security at the meeting looking for her. She couldn't just walk in the front door. She needed a proxy, Someone with a legitimate right to be there who could cede their time at the podium to her. Chloe, using her skills as an investigative journalist, found the perfect candidate, an elderly former employee of her father's firm, a woman who had lost her entire pension in the collapse and now held a small shareholder position in Keller Global. She despised Richard Keller and was more than willing to help. The night before the meeting, Alara sat alone in her apartment, the completed presentation loaded onto a new, encrypted laptop. The city lights glittered outside her window, a sea of indifferent stars. She felt a profound and lonely calm. Richard had taken her job, her money, and her reputation. He had tried to take her family's security. He had left her with nothing to lose. And tomorrow, she would show him just how much that had cost him. The grand ballroom of the Hyatt Regency was a cathedral of corporate power, a cavernous space filled with the low hum of anticipation. On the stage, a massive screen displayed the Keller Global logo, a stylized eagle with its wings outstretched, a symbol of predatory dominance. The room was packed with shareholders, analysts, and journalists, all waiting for Richard Keller's triumphant address on the future of his empire. Alara sat in the third row, nearly invisible in a simple gray suit, her hair pulled back severely. She was the guest of Mrs. Gable, the elderly shareholder who had agreed to be her proxy. Mrs. Gable sat beside her, a small, bird-like woman with eyes that burned with a quiet, decades-old anger. Security had barely glanced at them, their focus on the major players, the hedge fund managers and institutional investors. Richard took the stage to thunderous applause. He looked invincible, his tailored suit a suit of armor, his smile radiating confidence and power. He launched into his speech, a soaring symphony of synergy, growth, and shareholder value. He was a master showman, painting a picture of a future so bright and profitable it was blinding. And so, as we look to the next decade, he concluded, his voice ringing with manufactured passion, we stand on the precipice of unprecedented growth. Keller Global is not just a company. It is a promise of strength, integrity, and relentless innovation. The applause was deafening. The Q&A session began, a series of softball questions from friendly analysts. Then, the floor was open to shareholder comments. The moderator scanned the room. Mrs. Eleanor Gable, you have the floor. Mrs. Gable stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held the microphone. Thank you, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. I have been a shareholder since this company acquired Vance Capital. I lost my pension in that transition. I have a question, but I would like to cede my time to my guest. Who can articulate it far better than I? Before the moderator could object, Alara was on her feet, walking purposefully toward the podium at the side of the stage. A murmur went through the crowd. Richard, who had been smiling benevolently, froze. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition, then disbelief, then pure fury. Security, he said quietly into his microphone. Remove this woman. Two large men in dark suits started moving toward her, but they were too late. Alara had reached the podium. She plugged a flash drive into the port. My name is Alara Vance, she said, her voice amplified throughout the silent ballroom. And I am the daughter of Richard Keller's former partner, Arthur Vance. On the massive screen behind Richard, the Keller Global logo was replaced by the first slide of her presentation, the Phoenix Partners, PDF. The signatures of Arthur Vance and Richard Keller, stark and undeniable. A collective gasp swept through the room. Mr. Keller just spoke of integrity. Alara continued, her voice cold and precise. I'd like to present this body with a more accurate history of the company's foundation. Richard's face was a mask of rage. "This is a private matter. Turn that screen off," he hissed at the tech booth. But the technicians, stunned, did nothing. For the next 10 minutes, Alara systematically dismantled Richard Keller's life. With the icy calm of a seasoned analyst, she presented the evidence, slide by slide, the partnership agreement, the flowchart of the offshore shell corporations, the wire transfers from the Phoenix project to Richard's personal holding company, complete with dates, account numbers, and amounts totaling over $200 million. The final slide was an encrypted email from her father to Richard, dated the day before his death. She had only decrypted it that morning. "You took everything. Rick. It wasn't enough to win. You had to burn the whole world behind you. I hope it was worth it." The room was in an uproar. Journalists were scrambling, broadcasting live from their phones. Board members were staring at Richard in horror. His empire was collapsing in real time, live-streamed to the world. As she prepared to deliver her closing statement, a private chat window popped up on the corner of her laptop screen, visible only to her. It was from Marcus Thorne. "He betrayed us both. Alara, now destroy him. Finish it for us." The words hit her like a physical blow. Us. M.T. brokered the peace. 3 legs of a stool. Marcus hadn't just been her father's friend. He had been the third partner, the silent partner. And he had been using her, feeding her information, guiding her investigation, all to get his own revenge on Richard for a betrayal she knew nothing about. He had manipulated her grief and her anger for his own ends. She looked up from her screen, her mind racing. She had him. She had the evidence to destroy Marcus, too. A single sentence, a hint about a third man, and his life would be over as well. The room waited, silent, for her to deliver the final blow. Richard stood on the stage, a broken man, his face ashen. This was her moment of choice. Was she an instrument of someone else's vengeance? Or was she the arbiter of her own justice? Was this about total annihilation? Or was it about the truth? Alara took a deep breath. She looked directly at the main camera broadcasting the event to the world. "The evidence I have presented here is incontrovertible proof of wire fraud, embezzlement, and a decade-long conspiracy led by one man, Richard Keller," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. She did not mention Marcus. That was a separate battle, one she would fight on her own terms, not as a proxy. "He didn't just build an empire on a lie. He built it on the ruins of my family. I leave it to the board of directors, the SEC, and the Department of Justice to take the appropriate action." She unplugged her flash drive, turned, and walked away from the podium. She didn't look back at the chaos erupting behind her, at the flashing cameras, at the stunned faces of the board, or at the shattered figure of Richard Keller, a king deposed in his own court. Her revenge was complete, but her fight for justice was just beginning. The aftermath was a maelstrom. The live-streamed implosion of Richard Keller became the biggest financial news story of the decade. The video of Alara's presentation went viral, a masterclass in corporate regicide, within hours. Keller Global's stock had plummeted, wiping out billions in market value. The SEC froze the company's assets, and federal agents descended on its glass and steel headquarters. Richard Keller was arrested that evening, attempting to board a private jet bound for a country with no extradition treaty. He was photographed in handcuffs, his face not of a titan, but of a common criminal, haggard and defeated. Alara watched it all unfold from the quiet sanctuary of her apartment. She refused all interview requests, rejecting the media's attempts to cast her as either a vengeful heroine or a tragic victim. She was neither. She was simply a woman who had finished a job. Her focus was not on the past, but on the future, and on the loose thread that was Marcus Thorne. She met him 2 days later in the same library where he had given her the key to her plan. He looked older, the confident charm replaced by a weary anxiety. "You were brilliant, Alara," he said, his voice a low conspiratorial whisper. "You did what I never could. You took him down." "Why didn't you tell me you were the third partner?" Alara asked, her voice flat, devoid of accusation. "It was a simple request for data." Marcus flinched. It was complicated. After Richard pushed Arthur out, he turned on me. He threatened to expose my involvement if I ever spoke up. He left me with my career. But he took my share. I was a coward. I watched him build an empire with our money. And I did nothing. "So you used me," Ilara stated. "You used my father's memory and my pain to fight a battle you were too afraid to fight yourself." "I helped you," he countered, a desperate edge to his voice. "I gave you the tools you needed. We wanted the same thing." "No," Ilara said, her gaze unwavering. "You wanted revenge. I wanted the truth. They are not the same thing." She stood up. Her part in their shared history concluded. "I have all the evidence of your involvement. Marcus, the journal entries, the financial links. I haven't given it to the authorities." Relief flooded his face. "Thank you. Ilara, I—" "Don't thank me," she interrupted, her voice turning to ice. "I'm not protecting you. I'm establishing my own moral code. Richard was a criminal. You were a coward. The law will deal with him. Your conscience will have to deal with you. But know this, I have the evidence on a dead man's switch. If anything ever happens to me, or my family, it goes public. You will spend the rest of your life knowing your fate is in my hands. That is your sentence." She walked away, leaving him alone among the silent, dusty books, a ghost in his own life. She had established her own justice, one that was nuanced and personal, separate from the blunt instrument of the law. In the following weeks, the legal threads began to be tied up. The lawsuit against her family's estate was dropped. The bogus federal charge against her vanished as if it had never existed. Her assets were unfrozen. She was free, but the victory felt hollow. Destroying Richard had not brought her father back. It had not erased the years of living under the shadow of his perceived failure. She quietly distanced herself from the chaos. She moved out of her apartment, changing her number and cutting ties with the financial world that had both made and unmade her. She needed to build something, not just tear things down. Months later, the legal storm had passed. Richard Keller had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy and was serving a lengthy sentence in federal prison. The bulk of his stolen assets had been seized by the government after a protracted legal battle. A significant portion of that money, the funds proven to have been embezzled directly from the Phoenix Project, was awarded to a victims' compensation fund. As Arthur Vance's sole heir and the individual responsible for uncovering the crime, Ilara was granted control over a substantial portion of those funds. The final scene of her long war did not take place in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in a modest, newly renovated office space in a quiet part of the city. The name on the frosted glass door read, "The Phoenix Foundation." Ilara stood before a small group of people, lawyers, social workers, and the first 3 families the foundation would be helping. They were people like her own family had once been, stripped of their savings and their dignity by the complex, faceless crimes of the powerful. "My father was part of a venture that caused immense harm," Ilara said, her voice clear and strong. She no longer spoke of him as a victim or a villain, but as a complex, flawed man. His legacy was one of ruin. The purpose of this foundation is to transform that legacy. We will provide financial support, legal aid, and counseling to the families of victims of white-collar crime. We will use the profits of a destructive enterprise to build a future of healing and empowerment. It was not an act of erasure, but of transformation. She was not trying to forget the past, but to use its painful lessons to forge something new, something that would honor the good man her father could have been, while atoning for the mistakes he had made. It was an act of rebirth. That evening, back in her new home, a small house with a garden, she sorted through the last of her father's belongings. The final item was a small, sealed envelope she had found with his journal, marked simply for Alara. When it's over, her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. It was a letter, written in his familiar, elegant script, dated the day before he died. My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, it means the world knows what I have done, and what was done to me. I do not write this to ask for your forgiveness, for I do not deserve it. I was a man who wanted to build an empire, and, in my pride, I made a deal with a serpent. Greed is a poison, and I drank it willingly. I failed you, and I failed your mother. That is a truth I must carry into the dark. But I have one final hope, that the brilliance and fire I always saw in you, the integrity that I myself lacked, will be strong enough to survive the wreckage of my life. Do not let my failures define you. Do not let my story be your own. I destroyed. You, my darling girl, must build something good from these ashes. That is my only and final request. All my love, Dad. Tears streamed down Alara's face, hot and cleansing. They were not tears of grief for the man she had lost, but of release for the father she had finally found. His love, his regret, his hope for her, it was the final piece of the puzzle. The emotional closure that no victory in a boardroom could ever provide. The revenge was over. The justice was served. And now, her own life, built on her own terms, could finally begin.